On the 9th of January 2026, an executive order declaring a national emergency exposed one of the most complex constitutional questions in decades. 6 days after an unauthorized military operation by Congress, the White House moved to protect billions in Venezuelan revenues, activating a direct conflict over the limits of presidential power. The White House issued an executive order that declared a national emergency to protect Venezuelan oil revenues held in U.S. Treasury accounts. The decree came after an American military operation that culminated in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife on Venezuelan territory. This event activates a fundamental conflict in the separation of powers over how far presidential powers extend to conduct military operations and declare national emergencies without explicit congressional authorization. The Senate advanced a war powers resolution by 52 to 47 votes, but did not reach sufficient majority to override a presidential veto. The question transcends Venezuela. Legal scholars argue that this case establishes precedents on how presidents can use emergency declarations to circumvent congressional limitations in foreign policy. The implications extend to future conflicts where executive power confronts legislative oversight on issues of war, international commerce, and national security. In September 2025, the U.S. Southern Command began conducting military strikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea, alleging some were trafficking drugs on behalf of Venezuela. Trump ordered a complete oil blockade of sanctioned Venezuelan tankers. In November, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado promised to open Venezuela's oil and gas reserves during a business meeting in Miami, attended by Trump. The administration intensified pressure on the Venezuelan government, alleging that Maduro was the head of a narco-terrorist organization. On the 3rd of January 2026, U.S. armed forces conducted military strikes in Venezuela, capturing Maduro and his wife and transporting them to New York to face drug trafficking-related charges. Venezuelan officials said at least 23 Venezuelan security officers were killed during the attack, while the Cuban government said 32 members of the Cuban military and intelligence agencies were killed. Trump declared that the United States would run the country until an adequate transition. Congressional intelligence leaders were notified about the operation after it was underway, not before. Trump said congressional leaders were not notified beforehand because Congress has a tendency to leak. 2 U.S. officials told NBC News that information about the operation was so tightly guarded that the Defense Department was not informed of the exact timing until Friday night. Democrats questioned the legality of the president's actions. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said, "The administration has assured me 3 separate times that it was not pursuing regime change or taking military action in Venezuela." Clearly, they are not being straight with Americans. Republican Mike Lee initially questioned, "I look forward to learning what, if anything, might constitutionally justify this action in the absence of a declaration of war or authorization for the use of military force." Hours later, after a phone call with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Lee changed his position. This action likely falls within the president's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect U.S. personnel from an actual or imminent attack. On January 8, the Senate voted 52 to 47 to advance a war powers resolution aimed at blocking U.S. military use against Venezuela without congressional authorization. The measure passed with support from 5 Republican senators, but did not reach a veto-proof majority. The next day, Trump signed an executive order declaring a national emergency to protect Venezuelan funds from judicial process and met with oil company executives in an attempt to secure American investments in Venezuela. At the meeting, ExxonMobil CEO Darren Woods told Trump that Venezuela is currently uninvestable. The Constitution establishes a fundamental tension between executive efficiency and democratic control. Article 2 grants the president powers as commander-in-chief, but Article 1, Section 8, grants Congress the exclusive power to declare war. Since World War II, presidents have generally initiated military actions using constitutional powers as commander-in-chief without formal declaration of war. The founders deliberately divided military authority with Alexander Hamilton arguing in Federalist 69 that presidential power as commander-in-chief was limited to operational control of forces authorized by Congress. After decades of undeclared wars in Vietnam, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973, requiring the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. military into hostilities and terminate military use within 60 days unless Congress approves. Every president since Nixon has contested various aspects of this resolution, and the Supreme Court has never definitively decided whether its limitations violate the separation of powers. Trump cited the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 and the National Emergencies Act of 1976 as legal justification for protecting Venezuelan revenues. Since 1976, presidents have declared more than 50 national emergencies, but few have involved direct military action or control over foreign government assets. Trump's border wall emergency faced judicial challenges because courts questioned whether it constituted a genuine emergency requiring unilateral executive action. Republicans like House Intelligence Committee Chairman Rick Crawford and Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Tom Cotton referred to the attack as a law enforcement operation executed with military assistance. This characterization attempts to circumvent war powers limitations by framing military action as law enforcement. The precedent for this interpretation remains limited, with the 1989 Panama invasion to capture Manuel Noriega offering the closest parallel. Although that operation faced significant congressional criticism, the administration informed only the top members of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees after the operation was underway, following intelligence briefing protocols rather than war powers requirements. Rubio said the administration called Congress members immediately after the operation, adding that this is not the kind of mission that you can do congressional notification on, arguing that prior notification would compromise operational security. The NYC Bar Association argues that the actions violate Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress, not the president, the exclusive power to declare war and also contravene the War Powers Resolution of 1973. The administration counters that Article 2 powers include authority to protect American interests and conduct law enforcement operations against indicted criminals. Senator Tom Cotton argued that Congress isn't notified when the FBI is going to arrest a drug trafficker or cybercriminal here in the United States. The executive order states that the possibility of attachment or imposition of judicial process against the funds constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Critics question whether protecting Venezuelan oil revenues constitutes a genuine national emergency, especially considering that Trump stated that American oil companies would invest billions to fix Venezuelan oil infrastructure, raising questions about economic versus security motivations. President George H.W. Bush's Panama invasion offers the closest historical parallel, characterizing the operation as law enforcement against an indicted trafficker. However, that operation lasted days rather than establishing ongoing administrative control, and Bush provided more extensive congressional consultation. President Clinton faced congressional challenges over Kosovo bombings in 1999, and Obama encountered similar resistance over Libya intervention in 2011, but both involved time-limited military action. The current approach differs significantly by claiming ongoing administrative authority. Trump declared that the United States would run the country until an adequate transition, suggesting long-term involvement that exceeds typical military operations. Trump reaffirmed and expanded his policy of a modern version of the Monroe Doctrine, calling it himself the Donroe Doctrine. The Supreme Court's 1952 Steele seizure case established that presidential power is strongest when acting with congressional authorization, uncertain when Congress is silent, and weakest when acting against congressional will. Current events potentially fall into the third category. Since Congress has not authorized military action against Venezuela, although the administration argues that existing drug trafficking laws provide implicit authorization, Republicans largely celebrated the military operation, while Democrats condemned the actions and questioned their legality, representing a potential shift from traditional Republican skepticism about executive power expansions. House Speaker Mike Johnson said Trump was putting American lives first, succeeding where others have failed. Democratic senators like Brian Schatz warned that the United States has no vital national interest in Venezuela to justify war, while Bernie Sanders condemned the strike, citing risk of global instability. Multiple organizations have filed lawsuits challenging the legality of the actions, and federal courts will face pressure to decide quickly on constitutional questions. The Supreme Court's conservative composition has generally supported executive authority in national security matters, but justices have also shown concern for legislative prerogatives in war powers cases. United Nations officials, other countries, and international law experts said the operation violated the UN Charter and Venezuelan sovereignty. The NYC Bar Association argues that the actions establish a dangerous precedent where a nation can indict and militarily remove a leader of a smaller adjacent country. Allied nations may question American commitment to international law, and the operation could complicate American criticism of Russia's actions in Ukraine or China's territorial claims. Trump stated that American oil companies would invest billions to increase oil production, but ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and Chevron reportedly had no prior knowledge of the operation. ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil left Venezuela after their assets were expropriated in 2007, while Chevron continued its operations, and both companies that left have filed arbitration cases seeking billions in compensation. The emergency order protecting Venezuelan revenues may complicate these existing legal claims. The order declares that revenue is held solely for sovereign purposes, and that judicial attempts to seize funds will materially harm national security, attempting to invoke sovereign immunity. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, but production has plummeted due to corruption, sanctions, and mismanagement. Successful American control could significantly impact global energy markets. Federal courts could decide that the operation falls within legitimate executive powers to combat drug trafficking, establishing precedent for future interventions characterized as law enforcement. This would allow presidents to circumvent congressional authorization and permanently expand executive authority in foreign policy. Alternatively, Congress could pass veto-proof legislation, specifically limiting presidential authority for military operations, strengthening congressional war powers, and establishing clearer limits on executive authority. Extended judicial challenges could create institutional uncertainty about executive authority limits, with different federal circuits issuing conflicting decisions. International allies could distance themselves from American operations pending constitutional resolution, weakening American credibility and complicating future diplomatic initiatives. The operation could also encourage other major powers to justify interventions using law enforcement precedents, with China or Russia citing American actions for their own military operations. Senator Tim Kaine plans to bring his latest war powers resolution to a vote, testing whether legislators will impose limitations on executive action. The Venezuelan case may become a central theme in 2026 congressional races, similar to how Iraq war authorization influenced 2006 elections. Republican candidates may face pressure to support Trump's actions while defending constitutional principles, while Democrats could campaign on strengthening congressional oversight. Trump's pardons of election deniers are a reminder that the 2026 midterms will face extraordinary new pressure: the federal government itself. The Venezuelan operation adds another dimension to political campaigns, forcing candidates to take positions on executive authority and military intervention. Federal courts will determine whether the law enforcement characterization overcomes constitutional objections about war powers. As noted by a recent federal court decision, separation of powers was designed to implement a fundamental insight. Concentration of power in the hands of a single branch is a threat to liberty. Congressional response will indicate whether Congress is prepared to assert constitutional authority. Republican Mike Lee initially questioned constitutional justification, suggesting potential cracks in Republican unity. Venezuelan government stability will reveal whether American administrative control can succeed practically while corporate decisions about Venezuelan investments will reveal whether economic objectives can justify constitutional precedents. This case tests fundamental questions about modern democratic governance. Can presidents use national security justifications to circumvent constitutional limitations? Do law enforcement characterizations allow military action without congressional authorization? Can emergency powers protect executive policies from judicial review? The answers will shape American constitutional law for generations. If presidents can characterize military interventions as law enforcement operations, congressional war powers become meaningless. If emergency declarations can protect executive policies from challenge, judicial review faces serious limitations. Success in Venezuela may encourage future administrations to use similar approaches, fundamentally altering how America conducts foreign policy, shifting from multilateral diplomacy and congressional oversight to unilateral executive action. This case resembles critical moments in American history when institutional balance shifted permanently, like FDR's court packing plan, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, or Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court. The Venezuelan operation tests whether constitutional limitations bind presidents during perceived crises. The founders designed separation of powers to prevent exactly this type of unilateral executive action. Whether these constitutional safeguards survive, this test will determine the nature of American democracy for future generations. The central constitutional question remains: in a system deliberately designed to divide power among three co-equal branches, when do national security justifications permit one branch to act without the others? The answer may define American governance for the remainder of the 21st century.